Okay, so thank you everyone for coming along tonight. Tonight we're going to be listening to Adrian at Edinburgh Futurist. So Adrian, can I hand over to you, please?
You certainly can, thank you. I will just try and make sure I'm sharing the right screen. Can everybody see a bright orange slide? Great. Okay. Okay, well, thanks everybody and good evening. Tonight, I'm going to talk to you about some hopefully new science, science that many people won't have come across yet, but science that in the next 3 to 5 years could end up slowing down human aging. And that would allow, oops, I don't know why my thing's not clicking. And if we can slow down aging, it would allow us all to live kind of longer, healthier lives. And that would be lives with less disease, less frailty, and less pain. But we'd also have more mental agility and more vitality, because nobody wants to live longer, just have a few more years in decrepitude. And that's why scientists and companies are focused on treatments that increase the human health span. That's the amount of time we live in good health. So I've split this presentation this evening into 2 halves. First, I'm going to talk about the recent paradigm shift in aging research. And this is how scientists now see aging as a clinical target, as something to be treated rather than just something to be studied. Then I'm going to show you 3 examples of novel treatments. These are treatments which attack the underlying causes of aging, and treatments which couldn't have even been imagined maybe 10 years ago. So how are scientists doing with these new age-combating therapies? Well, I'd like to share what I think is a bit of a glimpse of the future. Unfortunately, it's not quite the future where all experiments are done in silico, which is where experiments are done in computer simulations with models of the whole body and organs and tissues and cells right down to the individual atoms. But that is coming. But until then, most experiments are still done in mice, worms, and flies. But having said that, I'm going to introduce you to a senior citizen laboratory mouse. And this mouse is 2 years old, which is the equivalent of being about a 70-year-old human. And looking at it, you can probably see that it's losing its fur, it's looking a bit frail, and underneath, it's more likely to have cataracts and cancer. But this mouse is special because it's one of a group of mice given senolytics by a company called Ocean Biotechnologies, and I'm going to talk about that more later. But it is a good example of the sort of impacts these new approaches to aging-related diseases could have. So this is that same mouse after the treatment. And I think you can see that its fur has grown back a bit. And I know maybe there's some people in the audience which will find that particularly interesting, but it's not actually the most interesting effect. What you can't see from the pictures is that the treated mice were fitter, 50% less likely to get cancer, had better kidney function, and on average, lived 25% longer than untreated mice. Now, this treatment is still a few years away, and most treatments don't work as well in humans as they do in mice. But hopefully one day, if there's a concerted effort to slow down aging, we'll certainly find something which does work. And slowing aging, it's not been something scientists have really been focused on for that long. Yes, they try to prevent age-related diseases, such as diabetes, heart disease, and cancer, but not aging itself. So when did the idea of slowing aging actually start? And I'm not talking about the quest for immortality, which go back thousands of years. I'm talking about when there was a realistic scientific endeavor to slow down aging. And I think that's surprisingly recently. Certainly until 20 years ago, nobody had even thought about it. And researching even the basics of aging was a really tiny field. All we really knew was that aging happens over time, and it's just a consequence of living, or in biological terms, metabolism. And this is all the cellular level chemical reactions and protein building and DNA replication going on in your body every second of the day. And this area of science is called gerontology. And it's the study of the biological causes of aging. But we also know a consequence of aging is pathologies. That's the disease and deterioration we all see with age. And the dealing with these pathologies comes under the term geriatrics, and it's the care and treatment of the elderly. It attempts to prioritize and treat the often multiple chronic diseases suffered by the elderly. So we've got multiple causes of aging and multiple effects of aging. But no one ever said, hey, that aging thing in the middle looks like a bad thing. Maybe we should do something about that. That is until around the turn of the century, and somebody called Aubrey de Grey comes along. At the time, he was a computer scientist at Cambridge University. He was writing software in their genetics department and was also married to a biology professor. So at work and at home, he spent a lot of time having discussions about aging. And he was amazed to find out that no one in the aging field saw aging as a problem. It was just a curiosity, and an inevitable curiosity at that. But Aubrey saw it a different way. Coming from outside, he saw aging as damage that causes the pathologies. So the damage caused by the metabolism then causes the pathologies. And then being a technologist at the time, rather than a biologist, he saw damage as something that could be fixed with engineering. So he goes off to think about this. And I do mean have a really good think about this. He looked at all the known causes of aging at the time and came up with 7 categories that they all fit into. And for each of those categories, he then explained how theoretically they could be repaired using biotechnology. And he called this idea SENS, Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence. And these methods weren't things which were available then, and most aren't even available today. But in principle, he was saying that there's nothing in biology that makes aging inevitable. And he managed to get his very detailed thinking published in 2005 in the Technology Review, which is a magazine published by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, one of the world's leading universities. Now that looked like a good start. So how was it received? Well, for those with better insight, may have spotted the subtitle, Is He Nuts? And lots of people thought he was. So much so that they argued that his ideas shouldn't have even been published. But to cut a long story short, the magazine offered a $20,000 prize to anyone who would show that SENS is so wrong that it's unworthy of debate. But I'm glad to say nobody won that prize. And that was back in 2005. And how have things gone since then? Well, this is the cover of the same magazine in 2019. It's not gone too bad, and slowing down aging was never going to happen overnight, but the tide does seem to be turning. And a sure sign that progress is being made is that investors are now being tempted to come into the industry. Whereas scientists might be willing to spend their entire career, their whole life, with the possibility of getting a Nobel Prize at the end, investors want to see results in just a few years. And one very quick example of this, announced just September of this year, is the Longevity Science Foundation. They've committed $1 billion over the next 10 years to institutions and companies with the aim of extending healthy human lifespan to more than 120 years. And if it gets a fraction of the way in that time, that would be amazing. It's also good to see their mission is making longevity-focused care accessible to everyone. So there's a lot of people with a lot of money thinking, actually, this could be a serious science. So on to the first treatment that I want to talk about tonight. And this treatment is being developed by a company called Lysoclear. And they use an approach being used by many companies, which is targeting waste products which can build up in the cells of the body, which the body can't break down itself. Lysoclear are targeting age-related macular degeneration, or AMD. And AMD is a common condition that affects the middle part of the vision, often hitting people in their 50s and 60s. It doesn't cause total blindness, but it can make everyday activities like reading and recognizing faces difficult. Initially, there'll be blurring in the center of the vision, and this gets progressively worse until you might struggle to see anything at all in the middle of the vision. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I do want to quickly show you what causes age-related macular degeneration and what Lysoclear are trying to do about it. So first, let's have a look at the basic anatomy of the eye. You have the lens at the front and the optic nerve at the back, which takes signals to the brain. Then in the middle, what creates those signals are photoreceptors in the retina and the macula. And the macula is an oval-shaped area near the center of the retina, and it's about 0.5 centimeter across, and it's responsible for the central high-resolution color images that we see. If we zoom in a bit more detail, then we can see that the macula is formed of several layers of cells. The key ones being photoreceptors, and they convert the light into electrical signals, and also RPE cells, and these are retinal pigmented epithelial cells. And they help to keep the photoreceptors healthy. They provide nutrients from blood vessels, and they also take away waste. These RPE cells contain lysosomes. And these are basically mini acid baths in the cells in the body, and they break down most of the metabolic waste from the photoreceptors, but they're unable to break down all of it. And this remaining junk is generally referred to as lipofuscin. And one of the biggest culprits is what we call A2E. Now, I'm just going to quickly turn that diagram around 90 degrees. So the RPE cells are now at the bottom. And the red dots are the A2E, which are created by the receptor cells, but build up in the RPE cells. Eventually, it builds up so much that the RPE cells eject it to try to save themselves. And when this junk is expelled, it's called drusen. And what this drusen does is it physically separates the RPE cells from the blood vessels, impacting the central vision. At later stages, new blood vessels can form. But these new blood vessels can hemorrhage or leak, which is why the most severe cases are termed wet AMD, and it can lead to severe vision loss or even retinal detachment. So what's Lysoclear trying to do? They want to prevent the buildup of A2E so that it doesn't get ejected as drusen, stopping the disease while it's still in the dry phase. They've found a naturally occurring enzyme. They found it in fungus rather than humans. And they're trying to get this to enter the lysosomes of RPE cells and destroy the A2E accumulating there. In mice, they've seen a significant reduction in A2E burden, and they're currently testing delivery mechanisms to get the enzyme into human cells before hopefully starting clinical trials in the future. So the next therapy I want to talk about is called Thymus Regeneration. And it's a critical step in keeping the adaptive immune system healthy as we age. Now, the thymus is a small organ located behind the sternum or the breastbone. And its main function is to train the body's T cells. And the T in the T cells actually stands for thymus. And I'm going to talk about them more shortly. Just to be clear, don't want to confuse this with the thalamus, which is a small structure in the brain, which relays signals from the senses and helps regulate sleep, nor the thyroid, which is a gland in the front of the neck that releases hormones to control metabolism. Today, we're talking about the thymus, and it's responsible for training T cells ready to fight off infections. And I've called this treatment thymus regeneration because the thymus shrinks significantly with age, contributing to the failure of the immune system. And it's one of the reasons why elderly people are more vulnerable to infectious diseases, because they don't have fresh T cells ready to learn about new threats. And that's whether that threat is the common cold or more serious like cancer, because T cells can also kill cancer cells. And here's a diagram or an image of a cell doing just that. The large blue cell is a cancer cell. And as with all cells on its surface, it's covered with different types of proteins, some of which identify it as a cancer cell. And if the right T cell comes along, which has proteins on its surface that recognizes the cancer's proteins, then it will attack it. And some scientists think that the chance of one of the trillion cells in your body becoming cancerous remains pretty much even throughout the course of your life. But the reason cancer rates go up with age is that the immune system slowly degrades and it fails to catch these new cell mutations. This then allows them to become tumors, obviously with devastating consequences. So first, let's have a look at the function of the thymus in a bit more detail, and then see what can be done to fix it. As I said, the thymus is located just above the heart, and it's divided into two lobes, But if we zoom in, we can see what one of those lobes looks like in more detail. And it's made up of a patchwork of lobules. All of these have a similar structure: a dense outer part called the cortex and a central part known as the medulla. So how does this reasonably simple looking organ train the body's T cells? Well, the T cells are actually created in bone marrow from blood stem cells. At this point, they're more formally called lymphoid progenitor cells, as they haven't fully developed. And later on, when they're in the thymus, they're called thymocytes. But I think it's just easier to refer to them as T cells today. Anyway, these newly formed T cells travel through the bloodstream to the thymus, and they enter via the cortex. Here, signals encourage the T cells to develop receptor proteins on their surface, and these are needed for them to interact with foreign antigens. If they don't develop these receptors in the cortex, then they're discarded, and this is called positive screening. And that's why the cortex is so much denser than the medulla, because most T cells are destroyed before the surviving T cells continue their journey to the medulla. And here they undergo negative screening. And this is to make sure they don't stick to your normal cells, because that would mean they attack healthy tissue, resulting in autoimmune diseases. If they bind too strongly to the epithelial cells in the medulla, then they're triggered to commit cell suicide or apoptosis. This whole process takes about 2 to 3 weeks, with only 1 to 2% of the original T cells making it through both levels of screening. They then leave the thymus and make their way to lymph nodes and other lymphatic tissues around the body. Here, they wait for a new antigen to appear and then multiply thousands of times before spreading out across the body to fight the infection. So that's all clever stuff. As you can imagine, it's critical to the functioning of a healthy immune system. But what's quite surprising is the thymus withers away from quite a young age, and that process is called thymic involution. And this reduces the number of naive T cells available to fight new infections. As a proportion of body size, the thymus is at its largest when you're first born. It does continue to grow a bit, but reduces in proportional terms until your early teens, when it weighs about 40 grams. And then it starts to shrink, going down to about 10 grams as you get older. But even worse, most of it by then has turned into adipose or fat tissue. So the functional portion may weigh as little as 3 grams. Let's have another look at that thymus lobule. This is what a young one looks like, but compare it to an older one. All of the white tissue is fatty infiltrations that have replaced the normal thymus tissue that's needed to develop the T cells. So its actual capacity to create T cells is a small fraction of its peak. And this can mean when a new pathogen is encountered, like a new strain or coronavirus, the body can't train as many new T cells to attack it. That's also why older people don't respond so well to vaccines. There aren't any T cells left to learn about the new foreign antigens. And it's not just infections. As I mentioned earlier, T cells also fight off cancerous cells. So your chance of cancer increases as the size of your thymus decreases. So what are scientists and companies trying to do about this? Well, the company which has made the most progress so far is a company called Intervene Immune in Los Angeles. They ran a phase 1 clinical trial between 2015 and 2017 with 9 men aged about 60. That's an interesting age to do this trial because it's just before the immune system really begins to collapse. And they were treated for a year with a combination of human growth hormone, another hormone called DHEA, and metformin. Those last two were administered because they need to counteract the known side effects of human growth hormone, such as diabetes and high blood pressure. Which is why, although human growth hormone was popular in the noughties as a possible anti-aging therapy, it's not something to be taken without medical advice. To me, the downside of this treatment is that it requires weekly injections for a year, and the dosages have to be tweaked regularly for each recipient. And that makes me think it would be quite an expensive treatment to bring it to a clinical setting, but it's only a first-generation approach. We've got a long way to go yet. The results of this trial were published in 2019. 7 out of the 9 volunteers displayed significant thymic regeneration, meaning that some of the thymus tissue that had become fat had now reverted to functional tissue, which then resulted in an increase in the production of naive T cells, which is the important output of the thymus. They also noticed that inflammation in the participants had decreased. This was a double bonus because some attempts to boost the immune system result in increasing inflammation. Finally, they measured the biological age of the participants. This was measured by something called Grim age, and this looks at how DNA is expressed in the cells to determine how healthy you are. And they saw a reduction of 2 years in biological age, and this benefit persisted for many months after the end of the treatment. Intervene Immune is now running a slightly larger phase 2 clinical trial called TRIMEX. It's an extension of their original trial. It's recruiting a wider demographic with a wider age range and not all men this time. It also includes a randomized control group to check that it's not just the taking part or just one of the individual components of the drug cocktail that has the effect. They're hoping to complete this trial by the end of next year, and their preliminary results already indicate similar outcomes as before. So this is definitely a company to watch. But they're not the only organisation looking at this problem. Some researchers have found that inhibiting the production of sex hormones, either chemically or surgically, can also promote thymus growth. Although unsurprisingly, there's not many investors lining up to try and take that one to market. One of the companies they are looking to invest in, though, is Repair Biotechnologies. This is based in New York State, and their approach is to use gene therapy. Their research has shown that there's a master regulator gene called FOXN1 that governs the growth and activity of the thymus. And it's been found that FOXN1 expression reduces with age. So Repair Bio's gene therapy aims to increase the level of that FOXN1. They've had lots of good results so far in mice, including a big impact on cancer due to the increased number of T cells available to fight it. We're now waiting for them to get more funding to run human clinical trials. There's also Regeneration. They're based in Pittsburgh in the US again, and they have some pretty radical science around growing ectopic organs. And ectopic means in the wrong place. They're trying to use a patient's own lymph nodes as mini bioreactors to grow other organs inside the patient's own body. So they're located in the wrong place, but they're doing the right job. They're already in a phase 2 clinical trial with ectopic livers and have a proof of concept data showing that it also works in the thymus. And then they're also researching growing kidneys in the pancreas. So any of these could have a mind-blowing impact on the health in just a few years' time. And finally, and for a change not based in the US, and based very locally, is work being done at Edinburgh University Centre for Regenerative Medicine. They study how stem cells could be used for tissue repair. And one of its labs is headed up by Claire Blackburn. And that focuses on thymus regeneration. Although they've not published anything recently, back in 2014, they took mice fibroblasts, which are cells found in connective tissue that makes collagen proteins, and they reprogrammed them to behave like specialized thymus cells. When transplanted into mice, these cells formed a replacement organ that had the same structure, complexity, and function as of a healthy thymus. And this one would just have to be patient and wait for someone else to pick it up and try it in humans. So not only are there multiple organizations working to fix the problem of the shrinking thymus, they're also using totally different approaches. So it's more likely that at least one of these approaches will work. And it's also a good example of how rapidly aging research is progressing. Although the existence of the thymus has been known for 2,000 years, until the 1960s, it was thought to have no useful function. Then it took until the turn of the century to have a better understanding of the 2-stage T cell screening process, the positive and negative screening I mentioned. And now, only 20 years after that, we're already looking at ways to reverse the organ's decline. And the final treatment I want to talk about tonight, just checking the time, is senolytics. Oops, sorry, I'm a bit behind on my slides. Senolytics. These are a class of drug that could provide improvements to a wide range of age-related diseases. So what are they? Well, senolytics are drugs that clear out senescent cells, which I realise is only half an answer, because now you're probably thinking, what are senescent cells? Well, this is one where the media have their own name for them, and they're invariably referred to as zombie cells, which, although it sounds a bit dramatic, is actually quite a good description, because firstly, they're sort of dead, and they're also sort of alive. Secondly, they like infecting other cells with their zombiness. So as always, let's first take a look at senescent cells in a bit more detail, and then to see what we can do to get rid of them. Now, the main characteristic of senescent cells is that they can no longer divide. Whereas most cells in the body are able to divide, particularly when growing as a child, they also need to divide as an adult to replace old, dead, or damaged cells. And when a cell needs to divide, it duplicates its DNA. And then in an intricately choreographed process, the 23 pairs of chromosomes line up in the center of the cell. Spindle fibers reach out from opposite sides of the cell and pull the chromosomes apart, with the original and copied DNA going their separate ways. Then the cell pinches itself in the middle, and splits into two, leaving two identical daughter cells. However, amazing as that process is, and I really do find it amazing, I'm not going to talk about that tonight. What I am going to talk about, though, is why cells stop dividing. It was originally thought that human cells could divide as many times as needed, but in 1961, an American anatomist called Leonard Hayflick demonstrated that cells stop dividing after between 40 and 60 divisions. This number is now known as the Hayflick limit. And the reason for this limit is what are called telomeres at the end of the DNA. And telomeres are long sequences of DNA letters that don't code for proteins, but instead indicate the start and the end of the DNA. So this is a chromosome. And this is how the DNA wraps itself up in preparation for cell division. And the red bits at the end of the chromosome are the telomeres. But when a cell divides, the machinery that copies the DNA can't quite get to the end of the DNA strand, so a little bit of the telomere is truncated. And this happens each time the cell divides, which is initially fine, but after 40 to 60 divisions, the telomeres are now too short for the cell to replicate the DNA again, and the cell becomes senescent. There are a couple of other reasons why cells become senescent, such as DNA damage or cellular stress, all of which increase with age. So the number of senescent cells also increases with age, but whichever way they arise, senescent cells are no longer able to divide, so can't replace dead or damaged cells. Nor do they carry out their normal duties. They're alive and using up energy, but not really contributing much. If you've got senescent cells in the kidneys, they're not removing toxins from the blood. Or if they accumulate in the lungs, they can lead to chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or COPD. And researchers think that just 1 in 1,000 cells becoming senescent is sufficient to drive frailty. And even worse than that, even worse than not operating well themselves, they also cause havoc and aging around them. This is because senescent cells release a mixture of molecules called SASP, senescent associated secretory phenotype. And it's made up of signaling molecules, enzymes, and other factors. And it was only discovered in 2008 by Judith Campisi, a professor of biogerontology at the Buck Institute for Research on Aging. And this is another good reminder of how recent our knowledge on some fundamental causes of aging really is. So what's so bad about this SASP? Well, let's imagine we've got some nice healthy tissue made up of a layer of cells. And one of those cells becomes senescent and stops working so well. This senescent cell also starts releasing SASP, which causes two problems. Firstly, it causes chronic inflammation, or what's sometimes referred to as inflammation. It signals nearby cells in the same way as if the body needed to fight a pathogen or repair an injury. And these signals are good in the short term over the period of days, but if that continues for weeks or months or for the rest of your life, then these can have really bad negative effects. Inflammation is considered a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, some cancers, neurodegeneration, and many other chronic age-related diseases. The second problem with SASP is that it encourages nearby cells to also become senescent. And then these senescent cells release more SASP, increasing the number of malfunctioning cells in the area, leading to even more inflammation and more age-related diseases. So that's the bad news. And of course, I wouldn't be talking about senescent cells if I didn't think we could do something about that. And what we want to do is basically kill them. And that's where senolytics come in. Senolytics are drugs that selectively induce apoptosis or cell suicide in senescent cells. And selective is the key word with all drugs. We want to kill only the senescent cells, not the healthy ones. It would be easy to develop a drug which just killed everything. And the good news is there's estimated to be over 20 startups already developing senolytics, which is great because even if 90% of those fail, there'll still be 2 which deliver first generation therapeutics. And then that will encourage others to develop even better senolytic drugs. So let's have a quick look at a few of those now. Unity Biotechnology, they were the first to the market. Being first is sometimes good, but it also means sometimes bad. Unfortunately, their first drug, which targeted osteoarthritis in the knee, didn't work. Or at least it didn't work well enough. It was a phase 1 trial, which are always small with a few participants. And for some reason, there was a really high placebo effect in the untreated arm, which meant although this senolytic did work and it did improve the condition, it didn't work statistically enough to claim it a success. Luckily, this didn't put Unity off. Their second senolytic targets diabetic macular edema and wet age-related macular degeneration. And it's already in a phase 1 trial. The good news is they've not seen any adverse effects, and most participants show a significant improvement in their vision and retina health. They're already running a phase 2 study, and results are expected in early 2022. And that should provide even more data on how effective it is. The next organisation is Mayo Clinic. They're a huge academic medical centre covering 3 states in the US. They're running a phase 2 trial of fisetin. And this is a flavonoid found in many fruits and vegetables, including strawberries and onions. They're going to evaluate its effects on frailty, inflammation, and insulin resistance, which is a good wide range of age-related diseases. But note, although fisetin is a plant extract and can be purchased in health food stores, its possible downsides are not known yet. As with most supplements, very few clinical trials are carried out on them, so you probably shouldn't take it without clinical advice. Finally, there's Ocean Biotechnologies. They're the furthest away from clinical trials, but that's because they plan to combine their senolytic with a nanoparticle delivery system, which should better home in on senescent cells. And the more you can focus delivery on the target cells, the more drug that you can safely deliver. So far in the lab, what's called preclinical studies, a single treatment removed 70% of senescent cells, which would have a huge impact on tissue function. The mouse in the picture I showed at the start, that was one of the one which took part in one of Ocean's preclinical studies. If you remember, the mice were treated at 24 months, and that's the equivalent of a 70-year-old human. Now, normally, 4 months after that, when a mouse is 28 months old, about half of them have already died just because they're old. But in this experiment, the treated mice, only 10% had died rather than 50%. They were also healthier and fitter. This means that if Ocean's therapy performs in humans as it performed in mice, it would increase the median lifespan of humans by about 15 years. So life expectancy would jump from 83 to 98, and with a longer health span. Now, I don't think it will have that big an effect because these therapies never translate as well between mice and humans, but it could easily mean living a few years longer with more of those years in good health. And in May of this year, Ocean received another $5 million of funding to run human clinical trials, which are expected in the next year or two. So things are really looking interesting on the senolytics front. As always, things are a bit more complicated than I've had time to explain this evening. The main complication is that not all senescent cells are the same. There's a wide variety of them. So to attack them, we'll probably need a few different senolytics. But on the positive side, cells take quite a few weeks to turn senescent once they've been triggered. And it looks like removing only 30% of them should be enough to slow down age-related decline. And remember, we didn't even know what SASP was until 2008. And since then, we've already developed a whole new class of drug ready for clinical trials. And this sort of rapid progress is being made in a good number of aging disciplines. So with this speed of understanding increasing more and more every year, helped by faster computers to model cells, and also with automated laboratories, just imagine what could happen in the next 20 years, or maybe just the next 5 years, things that could really help us all to live longer, healthier lives by slowing down aging. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you, Adrian. So are you happy if we go to some questions now, if that's okay?
Absolutely fine, yes.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions within the group? So feel free to kind of unmute yourself now, and you know, you can turn on the camera if you're happy to. Does anyone have any questions at all?
I do.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Is that right? All right, go ahead. At what age would you start to take any of these drugs or therapies? Is it when you're young, or would it be once you get to a certain age?
Well, fortunately, it's a great question, because some of the early experiments and certainly lots of current studies, you know, that they rely on the treatment being almost from birth. Yeah, and that's just unrealistic for people of a certain age who are starting to think about trying to live a bit longer. You know, it's too late. They can't have started it when they were 20 or even younger. But luckily, lots of these treatments are actually designed to work, you know, by the middle age or even by your 60s or 70s. So, for example, senolytics, you know, senescent cells build up over time. You don't notice it when you're younger. Lots of these age-related diseases, you know, you don't notice when you're younger, almost by definition. That's why they're an age-related disease. So senolytics, probably something you can start taking when you're 60, you know, when they're fully developed and safely released, because it will just knock out some of those senescent cells and kind of knock you back a couple of years. There's other things, one I didn't have time to talk about tonight, is young plasma. So lots of researchers are looking at the plasma in your blood and kind of rejuvenating that. And again, they think you could probably do that around a similar age, that, okay, you just clean it up and it kind of just resets the body clock, or certainly knocks it back by potentially 10 or 20 years. So yeah, hopefully everybody's realizing you don't want something you've got to start when you're 18, you know, maybe even when you're 80, you might still be able to take some of these treatments.
Oh, great. So there's hope for me yet then.
Me too.
Thank you.
Adrian, do you mind just stopping screen sharing, if that's okay, please? So we've got a question from Chris, and then I'll come to Liz, and Carol, I saw you have a question as well. So Chris, do you want to ask your question?
Sure, Adrian, thank you very much for the very, very interesting talk. Excellent, excellent. So you personally, are you taking any supplements? Which supplements are you taking?
Yeah, and before I say, I will certainly say I'm never giving advice. You know, I've always got a big disclaimer saying, you know, no clinical advice. I mean, a slightly longer answer before I say what I am taking, and it's not very interesting what I am taking, is that, there's almost nothing around today which has been proven to really slow down aging. Much as many people will claim it, there's hardly anything. These treatments are all a couple of years away. They're in clinical trials, so we are, 2, 3, 4 years away. The main supplement or family of supplements which most aging researchers are taking, me and others are certainly taking, are what we call NAD boosters. And the two classics are NMN and NR. And I should have written down what they stand for, But if you just search for, it's like nicotinamide mononucleotide or something, and nicotinamide riboside. And these work to boost your level of NAD. And that is a molecule in your body which declines over time, but is fundamental for lots of the energy transfer between cells, but also some other pathways as well. And almost everybody, there's a guy called Professor David Sinclair at Harvard. He's one of the leading people who've come out in the last few years, which is a great sign, because I think he said if he had come out 10 years ago to say he is trying to slow down or stop aging, he'd have probably been sacked. It was just not something scientists could say. But he's now come out, there's a book called Lifespan. He's taking, I think he takes NMN, and other people take NR. And basically they both work in a similar way in what we call the salvage pathway to get kind of more NAD into the cells. So that's what I am taking. I've tried both on the website. I've blogged about my experiences and how my bloods have changed over time when I've been taking both of those. I take vitamin D as well, because Northern Hemisphere, particularly in Scotland, definitely a classic one you need to be taking. Beyond that, really, I'm not sure. Maybe, it's all very personal after that, I think.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Great. So if we can come to Liz now, I then have Carol, Brian, and Nicole just in the list. Sorry, Liz, are you happy to ask your question? Yeah, sure. Sorry. Do you want to come off mute, or do you want me to read out the question? Oh, yeah, sure, I'll read it. So we have just a few questions. Which of the products have the highest phase of clinical trial? And was the clinical trial conducted using healthy individuals or those who already had the disease? And then also just a little question about exercise, active life, and healthy lifestyles. Do we know the mechanisms in slowing the aging process?
Okay. Probably more detail than I can recall in one go. I think there are the trials I've mentioned. There's a couple in phase 2. I don't have the list in front of me as to which ones are in phase 2, and there's certainly more in phase 1, as there always will be, because some will fail. And so I actually forgot what the question was. It was like, which ones are coming available?
Yeah, sorry. So the products that have the highest phase in clinical trial,
yes.
And whether they use healthy or diseased individuals?
Yes, well, that's a great interesting one, because lots of this is, because it's trying to address aging, it's such a wide range. Actually, it doesn't matter if some of these people have certain diseases. So whereas if you're trying to address lung disease, you've got to find someone with lung disease. You are trying to just treat people who are just generally getting old and not having a particular disease, but that shouldn't discount them from the trial. So I am waffling a bit, apologies. And I think, I can't remember. I remember reading one trial where they, in their phase 1, they did have some unhealthy volunteers, but they increased that to a wider range of more healthy volunteers in the phase 2. So I can't really help on that one much. And the actual underlying mechanism of aging, I'm not a biologist. I'm not even going to pretend that I understand. There's plenty of people looking into it. There's plenty of people who look at kind of what they call exercise mimetics or calorie restriction mimetics, which look at 2 of the basic things you can do to try and live longer, and then try and see, well, what would help with that. Possibly sort of related to that is most of the big effects you'll ever see reported are in unhealthy individuals or unhealthy mice. So, all the big effects are, well, if you're unhealthy and you take something which mimics exercise or mimics a low-calorie diet, then you get healthy. But if you're already exercising and you already have a good diet, it is actually, it's quite hard to push up those years beyond that.
Yeah, interesting. Carol, I'll come to you now, and then Brian, I'll come to you next.
Hi, thanks, Adrian. 2 questions, if that would be okay. So the first question is about autoimmunity. So you mentioned autoimmunity. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit into that, about the trials and perhaps anything else. The second question was related to fasting, and I'm wondering if that had an impact on autoimmunity.
Okay, so again, sorry, autoimmunity, not my specialist subject. I've not seen any age-related or longevity treatments specifically targeting that. Probably because it is, those are specific diseases. What something like the senolytics, as I mentioned, they've got to be careful of is making sure if you're triggering an improvement in the immune system, you're not also triggering something which will fight against the body itself. So definitely can't help that with the autoimmunity. Sorry about that. On the fasting, people do think that's a good idea. And I mentioned calorie restriction earlier. And just to be clear for people who haven't heard about that, we're not talking about a low calorie diet there. We are talking really significantly low, like 800 calories a day or something low, where you've really got to not just hardly eat anything, but what you eat has to be so nutritionally dense to make up for all the nutrition you're missing out on. That's been shown to increase the lifespan of many animals quite significantly. In humans, it's harder to show, possibly has an effect, possibly doesn't. But why I'm mentioning that is that people are now starting to think that maybe some of the effects of calorie restriction is actually because you're only eating once a day. And by having kind of 16 hours off or more hours off a day not eating, that is a big part of calorie restriction. So you don't even have to fast necessarily for 2 or 3 days at a time. There seems to be more and more research coming out saying if you just have 1 meal a day and you don't eat the rest of the day, then that will have a similar effect as quite significant calorie restriction.
Okay, that's lovely. Thanks, Adrian.
Okay.
Brian, can I come to you now, and then Nicole, I'll come to you next.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. It was really interesting talk, Adrian. Thanks. My question was just around where the focus is. It seems very focused on the cellular and the hormonal sort of level, whereas I almost get the sense that in previous years there have been lots of work into sort of brain and neural sort of side, and perhaps in relation to Alzheimer's and such like dementia. Is that something that you're aware of, or are they both getting progressed in tandem?
Yes, most of the research or the therapists are trying to work at that cellular level because that affects the entire body. So whether that is the senolytics or the blood plasma I mentioned, this is affecting the whole body. Cellular reprogramming, where they try and actually reverse the age of individual cells, because if you reverse the age of the individual cell, that will make the tissue that it's in more youthful. It will make the organs that the tissue builds up more youthful. And the hope is that will then make the whole body that those organs make up more youthful. I mean, other research are certainly looking at other ways of growing new organs, 3D printing organs, so that if you do have an organ failure before you're able to slow down your aging, then we've got better therapies than are currently available. As always, I always forget the second part of the question, but I get half of my rant.
Yeah, no, in a sense you've touched it, it was just around the brain and the neural side of it.
What I will mention is, yes, there's an interesting thing, which I sometimes do say in the talk, is that in America, there's the National Institute of Aging. And just to emphasize how little funding basic aging research gets, is that even something with aging in its title, the National Institute of Aging, about 90% of its budget goes on dementia research. And I fully understand that. And I know it's Alzheimer's and Parkinson's are more serious and atrocious diseases, but they are all symptoms of aging, not causes of aging. So that's why more and more scientists are saying, well, actually, if we could crack aging, we would maybe slow down and prevent Alzheimer's at the same time.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, go right to the source. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. Great, thank you. So if we could go to Nicole now, and then I'll come to Ryan.
Thank you, Adrian. That was fantastic. My question is around fasting. I do a 23-hour fast a day and in a 1-hour window. I understand, this potentially has impact on mitochondria, sort of maybe, the genesis of new mitochondria is clearing out old defunct mitochondria. My question is I don't think I'm aware of whether or not fasting potentially, can that also potentially clear out senescent cells, or is there any way to slow down the depletion of the telomeres through fasting? I don't know if there's anything that I'm not aware of that maybe.
It sounds like you're probably, in the area of fasting, probably ahead of me on the knowledge, but I'm more than happy. I'll make a note. On the meetup board, I can do a quick bit of research, find my notes, because I've got an awful memory. I mean, I would say the reason I've got a website is because I can't remember anything. So I've got it all categorized on there with lots of articles, because my recall is almost zero. So I'm more than happy to quickly check the database and post a couple of links on the meetup group tomorrow or something.
That would be wonderful. I mean, I'll, when the Senolytics come out, I'll take it all, but I'm just sort of thinking, right, what can we do until
yes,
as it's available? So that would be great. Thank you, Adrian.
Okay, no problem.
Fab. So Ryan, if I could come to you now, and I think Chris, you might have another question, so I'll come to you next.
Yep. Okay, great. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. I was just wondering, well, first off, great talk. Thanks for that. Do you know if there's any investment funds that are kind of funding the whole, startup longevity treatment scene? Is there anything specialized out there?
Yes, there are. There's plenty. I've got a whole section of that. Let me see if I can quickly. Well, that might be another one. Well, let me see. What can I do about that? Very quick. Investment. Yes, so there's some really. I mentioned that Longevity Science Foundation, which announced $1 billion of funding. There's also a similarly named Longevity Vision Fund, and they're investing 100 million. You've got the Forever Healthy Foundation with 300 million euros, and also a Maximon. Now, what I'm not sure about is I think most of these funds are currently kind of working with angel investors and people with significant investments, which may or may not be you. I've got no idea. I'm certainly struggling to find many places, if any, where if you've just got a general interest in longevity and you think, actually, I might like to put some money into those, there's not many publicly traded shares or investment funds that you can put your money into. But I can again put a list of the investment companies that I'm aware of up on the board, and then if you want to look into those, that would be great, because the more money that goes in, the more chance we all have of slowing down aging. And it's not just the money; it's also out talking to people. So do mention that these things are coming, because I find it fascinating what's just around the corner, and most people are totally unaware of it.
Oh, that's great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, funny, Adrian, that you mentioned that. A lot of the stuff that you talked about this evening, I can put my hands up and say I wasn't aware of it. So yeah, definitely interesting. And Chris, I think you might have another question.
Sure. Just the question really is on, why do we think we can fix aging when evolution hasn't fixed aging, Adrian? And it's really about the sort of root causes of why humans or animals age. Is it an evolutionary driven process? Are we sort of like machines that are sort of wearing out, or what is that? I've lost.
You cut off at
Can you
the
still hear me,
Chris, but I think I've got that. No, yes, I mean, you're right. There are plenty of theories as to why we age and why evolution hasn't figured it out. I think one of the big ones, and certainly the one that David Sinclair goes for, is that it's so important that a species does not live too long, because otherwise it's subject to kind of collapse when there's a change in its surroundings. So there's some very fundamental processes in our DNA which are seen in everything, all the way back to yeast, from yeast all the way up to mammals, and it's seen, and it seems to be that if you allowed a species to grow for too long, then if there's a major volcano incident or something, the species can be wiped out really quickly. But by having something where you have to have these generations balanced in time, and that's why some things, when there's if the calorie restriction, they think that works because your body says, oh, hang on, there's a problem, we better live a little bit longer, stretch things out, ready for the next generation. If you don't have those repeating generations, it's too easy for a species to be wiped out in one go. It's not my specialist subject, as you can tell. There's some really biological questions here. I mean, normally it's questions about the ethics, about overpopulation, only the rich will get it, and these are all legitimate concerns. And you've hit me with biology, which is just not my strongest subject. But there are plenty of theories. The classic ones, other classic ones are whether the evolution hasn't managed to balance the energy needs, that you'd need more energy to live longer. But lots of people prove, well, that's rubbish. Your body can balance multiple things. You can do lots of different things together. Why do you think, for some reason, if it didn't want to, that evolution couldn't have made you actually live like thousands of years? And it seems to be, it wouldn't be good for the species. Great for the individual, but not good for the species.
It seems to be, it must be an evolutionary driven thing somehow, because the lifespan of humans is so uniform. I mean, we don't live any longer. I mean, the longest person is supposedly 120 years old, and most people don't live anything like that. And you'd think if it was a random process, like we were wearing out or something like that, there'd be people living to 1,000, and most people would die well before that, but some people would just live on forever, because it would be we've got billions of people alive, and some of them would have just by
random chance.
Random chance exist for a very long time, and that doesn't seem to happen. So I think that's the thing that gets back to these interventions to make us live longer or age slower. Some point you have to understand why we die, why we age. Otherwise, we're not really, maybe we're going to add, like curing a disease, we're going to add a few years here or there, but we're not going to, get us to, extreme long life.
It is true. And actually that theory of aging being kind of driven, that it's not just random damage building up, the body is actively trying to kill you. That could be a problem, because all these things we're doing, the body might try and work out another way to try and kill you, basically.
Thank you.
Bad body.
Hopefully we're able just to squeeze in one more question, if that's okay. Desmond, I think you've got a question.
Yeah, really cheeky. Sorry, Charlotte, but thank you. So, Adrian, that was really good. But I suppose my question would be: obviously, you've spoken a lot about kind of the technologies that are coming down the tracks, and about the push factors for making us live longer, if you will, in terms of investment and the technologies that are being developed, the inventions, the science. What of the pull factors? Because it seems to me that a lot of these preventative treatments will obviously, you'll need to keep taking them throughout your life, so you'll need to be able to afford those in particular. And here in the UK, that will be particularly difficult, because we obviously have a very rigid, centralised state healthcare system. So what changes will, what changes are needed to pull that through? I'm thinking of things like insurance models, and what does the Live Forever Club and you think about those kind of things, and which ones are easy to implement? Because maybe those are the things people should actually be focusing on, to try and align the economic incentives for long life, and not just on lab work.
There's a really good point, because that's right. If someone says, what can you do today to try and live a lot longer? Yes, you can look at, well, what supplements could you take? Look at these treatments coming down a few years down the line. But one of the biggest things you can do is raise awareness, because the more people who are aware of it, the more people who want it, well, that will help encourage more investors to come in and more research and treatments to be developed. It will also encourage governments to change their regulations to allow this to happen, easier and faster. I think another crucial pull factor, whichever way around it is the fact that governments will want this, because although often people worry about overpopulation, some of the current world forecasts is that is going to level out by 2100, maybe even sooner. You've got some countries like Japan with a rapidly declining population. Their fertility rate, which you've got to have like average of 2.1 children per female to keep your level even. Some places are down to 1.5 already. So their population, is in a tailspin. So they need those people who are already alive to live longer and healthier, and that's the important thing. Governments don't want their population to live longer, taking up more and more NHS resources. But if you can get what's called compressed morbidity, just make people live on average longer, but only suffer disease for the last few months of their life, I mean, everybody will be happy. And that's actually the sort of results that I tend to see. I'm always looking at lab results to see, is anybody actually living longer? Really, is the maximum lifespan increasing? And some of these blood plasma experiments, they definitely make the average lifespan of the mice which are treated increase. But the actual maximum lifespan, has barely nudged. So nobody's living. It would mean that humans aren't going to get past 120. It might mean that almost everybody lives to 100, but not many people get past 120. But that would be great. I mean, even that would be a pretty good thing if we all lived a bit longer and we all lived, those extra years in good health. That would be a good result, even if we don't live significantly longer.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Great. Well, so that is our hour. Thank you so much for coming along and presenting, Adrian. It's been really, really interesting. And thank you everyone for coming along and participating with the group. Just a quick plug for Edinburgh Futurists. So our next event is in 2 weeks, and it's our book club where we'll be talking about June. So if anyone doesn't have time to read the 500 pages, fancies just seeing the film and coming along, you're more than welcome to. And then after that, on the 12th of December, we're having our one and only in-person meetup for our Christmas lunch. There's still 4 spaces on that, so if anyone is going to be in Edinburgh on the 12th of December, please feel free to pop in. And yeah, there's a few people mentioned in the chat that we can continue the longevity discussion there. So yeah, Adrian, if you happen to be in Edinburgh, then you're more than welcome to join.
If I was, I'd love to join.
Yeah. But thank you everyone for coming along, and have a lovely evening.
Lovely, thank you.